I thank the member for Lyons. Question is the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today in support of the Biodiversity Bill 2014, together with the package of supportive bills relating to biosecurity and quarantine. This bill replaces the original Act introduced to this Parliament in 1908, over 100 years ago. I think it's fair to say it's well and truly time for a dust-off, rethink and rework. On the enormity of the task, I would like to congratulate the member for New England, the Minister for Agriculture, together with the CSIRO, for their focus on our nation's biosecurity. Late last year, while releasing a green paper on agriculture competitiveness, the Minister said, "Biosecurity presented the greatest risk to the future of Australian agriculture, and that investment in biosecurity should never be compromised." Deputy Speaker, I could not agree more. Being a continent island, we have a wonderful natural barrier of protection to this land, but it is also one of our greatest threats. At the heart of this 605-page bill is the plan for risk management and preventing risks to human health. Not to mention a plan to protect Australian industry, especially that of the ongoing viability of agriculture, and in turn securing our food production. Because European settlement has set nature warning salvos across our bow, loud and clear. In the initial years of colonisation, it was the very coughs and colds our convicts brought to Australia from England. The then isolated Indigenous population had not been exposed to anything like this, and on some communities the impact was devastating. Then there were outbreaks, people quarantined for fear of all kinds of harmful and deadly diseases, including leprosy. But biosecurity encompasses other outbreaks, often because our own stupidity or lack of research. Perhaps most notably was the ill-fated attempt of the Bureau of Sugar Experimentation Station to control the Frenchy beetle, a pest in sugarcane crops, by introducing cane toads. That was in 1935. 80 years later, they've spread south to New South Wales and west across the top half of the continent, seriously threatening local flora, fauna, and even humans with their poison. Almost as foolhardy was the release of 24 rabbits by Thomas Austin in 1859. From Victoria, that release allowed the country to be overrun by rabbits in plague populations. The damage they caused is almost immeasurable, from soil erosion to the destruction of vegetation, not to mention the harm done to our native wildlife. It ran pretty much out of control until the 1950s, when myxomatosis was introduced as a control, and more recently, calivirus, which, nonetheless, we still have a rabbit problem. Then there was prickly pear, imported in the 19th century. The cactus was originally thought to be a good biological agricultural fence. That was until the plant went feral, and a South American moth was introduced in 1925, finally brought the prickly pear under control. Most recently has been the issue of fire ants, finding their way to Australia by container ship, and recent outbreaks around Botany threaten all regions of Sydney, including my electorate of Lindsay. The point is, we must forever be vigilant to keep our country clean and free from pests and diseases. Deputy Speaker, my electorate of Lindsay is home to communities such as Agnes Banks, Llandilo, Castlereagh and Mulgoa, the north and the south wings of my electorate. These areas are still agricultural lands based around the Nepean River, and are also home to some of our nation's most esteemed equine studs, and enjoy great success on both the international and local national stages. Local heritage estate like Fern Hill, once home to Sir Henry Parkes and the Cox family, is where the current owners work hard towards a dream of hosting international show jumping events in our region, not to mention their wonderfully successful picnic race days. On the north side of the Lindsay electorate is Castlereagh and Agnes Banks. They're spectacular properties where thoroughbred owners like Bart Cummings with the Princess Farm, Godolphin or Tyrrell, the home to some of our nation's greatest thoroughbreds like Melbourne Cup champion Saintly. A few years ago, in 2007, this community, alongside much of our equine community, faced an epidemic of equine flu that cut through the area like a rampant bushfire. You see, the first case of equine flu in Australia was confirmed in a stallion at Eastern Creek, also in Western Sydney. That stallion was in quarantine after arriving from Japan. Despite 60 horses at the Eastern Creek facility and Spotswood quarantine stations being placed in lockdown, equine flu still escaped. The flu could be caught via airborne particles. Worse still, it could travel kilometres on the wind, affecting horse studs suburbs away. All in all, 47,000 horses would test positive to the disease across nearly 6,000 properties throughout New South Wales and Queensland. Deputy Speaker, seeing what my own animal, my own horse went through is not something I would wish upon my worst enemy. It was awful and it was distressing. My horse got through the ordeal. I'm very lucky. Fontaine was very young at the time, but she did have youth on her side. Older and more mature horses were not so lucky and did not survive this outbreak. In an inquiry, former Judge Ian Callanan, who investigated the issue, described our quarantine system as inefficient, underfunded and lacking due diligence. Deputy Speaker, some important changes were made in the wake of Judge Callanan's finding, but the basic century-old legislation remained in place. That despite a mammoth operation, 50,000 horses had to be vaccinated, 132,000 lab tests had to be carried out, while 16,000 movement permits had to be issued. So many equine-based businesses like self-employed tradesmen, farriers, horse dentists, vet clinics endured an economic hardship. Some would never recover. My good friends Lynn and Michael White of Castlereagh Feeds were faced with an economic threat to their business, hence seeking to have to diversify their business into other forms of stock feed. Deputy Speaker, I go further. Lindsay is the home to a whole range of other businesses in the agricultural space, particularly poultry and egg farms. Businesses like Pirovic Enterprises, custodians of around 750,000 birds, one of the largest independent operators of poultry egg production in Australia. As recently as 2013 and even into last year, businesses like this were threatened by avian influenza outbreaks found around young. There were estimates around the time that the loss of chicken stocks were so severe. They were pushing up the price of eggs by as much as 20%. As it was, egg production was cut in New South Wales by 12%. Had that flu spread to my electorate, the local industry could have been absolutely decimated. That's because, Deputy Speaker, Pirovic farms in my electorate produce over 60,000 eggs per day. So it's a vulnerable industry, a vulnerable business. I might add that directly employs 130 local people and indirectly provides so many more jobs to people in Western Sydney. We must protect our food security. Egg production is in fact one of the most efficient forms of protein production. It is essential our biosecurity laws are up to date and the very best they can be, so that every protection possible is given to essential food-producing industries like egg production. When I speak to people like family business owner Franco Pirovic, he tells me this legislation is a good and solid start. He says this legislation will help tighten border controls and take into account the massive traffic numbers at these points. He says this legislation will streamline the processes should the worst happen, and that gives everybody more certainty. He also says the legislation provides a springboard for the government to start looking at new biosecurity battlegrounds, what he calls the post-border controls, because people like Franco see serious vulnerabilities. As consumer demand is pushing industries like his away from battery egg production to free range, animal vulnerability to diseases rises. It's a simple factor of having less control over the animal's cleanliness and more difficult operation to quickly quarantine, especially when diseases can quickly kill several kilometres once airborne. And it's not good when they're in industry trying to keep bird flu and other diseases like Newcastle disease out. On Franco's figures, there are around 17 million commercial laying hens across Australia, but at least they have voluntary industry codes. However, that push to be green and organic and the resurgence in unrelated background chicken farms, these farms have less than 10 chickens and not part of any voluntary code or system. In fact, as Franco points out, combined with the high number as 4.2 million backyard chickens being housed across Australia, have the potential to become a big and growing issue. And with the hens being bought and sold without regulation, many birds aren't even getting basic vaccinations, and that's a potential risk to an entire industry that is already vulnerable. It may be down the track, but there is a growing case to register pets and backyard birds in the same way we register cats and dogs. Further, domestic birds may need to have basic flu vaccinations in order to be bought and sold. Deputy Speaker, this legislation forms a modern framework where these ideas can be looked at and further legislated on. Down the track, legislation that defends country wildlife and, most importantly, our food security. But Lindsay supports other agricultural enterprises too. We are home to vegetable farms in Londonderry and mushroom enterprises in our mountains foothills. In fact, mushrooms from the electorate of Lindsay account for more than 20% of our nation's mushroom supply. Further, there are boutique wineries, sake manufacturers and many other fishing areas along the Nepean River. The point is, biosecurity affects us all. On the grounds, parts of my electorate are earmarked for major freight interchange and holding facilities, potentially bringing these issues, once faced by our ports, potentially straight into the heart of Western Sydney. This bill is equipped to meet the challenges of a modern trade and travel logistics. Today, the Department of Agriculture is annually clearing 16 million arrivals of passengers, 186 international mail items, and 1.7 million sea cargo consignments, as well as 26 million air cargo consignments. Those who wrote the bill in 1908 could never envisage these numbers, not to mention the advancement in air travel that has made our world all the more smaller and accessible. Container vessels of today would almost be inconceivable to the authors of this original bill. Science and research communities in my area have more certainty from this bill as the sector grows, with major transporting hubs being planned for the region. Deputy Speaker, there is a role in all of this for Australia to lead the world, and proudly the people of Western Sydney to lead the charge. Macarthur, the electorate to the direct south of Lindsay, is named after John Macarthur, the father of the merino sheep. It's the exact sheep credited for establishing Australia's export markets, coining the phrase, an economy riding on a sheep's back. Today, we as a region look to the future of an innovative area. We look to how we can grow further. We're excited about investments from companies like Biosecurity, who have a 256-hectare property to the very south of my electorate, where they are looking to grow a national food, science and research laboratory. We also have organisations like the Vivid Centre, which is part of Verbac, where they are taking place some of the most exciting research into animal health and also manufacturing their products. Deputy Speaker, I support this bill. This bill is important for our nation's future. It's important for our food security and it's important for all Australians. Thank you.